Welcome to the TFD Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Sullivan, and this is the show where we break down popular science into easily digestible and actionable information to give you the blueprint to be a high performer in your life. Today, I'm joined by TFD Dietitian Lauren Nash, and we are talking all things altitude. In this episode, we will discuss what altitude is, why people train in it, what it does physiologically to your body in the short and long term, what the signs and symptoms of altitude sickness are, and we dispel some myths about alternative training methods that claim to replicate altitude. This is a really interesting one, so let's get to it.
No, I know that face. You're going to include it. You're laughing. You're thinking this chick doesn't know. She's going to be on Spotify in 1 hour. Anyway, I'm just a bit rusty because you've been away in America. We haven't done a podcast for maybe a week or two, so I'm going to blame it on that. But welcome back, and I'm super glad to be doing this podcast with you today because it's pretty interesting. And you've just had some experience with it. I was watching a sporting event the other weekend, totally relevant. But what we're going to be talking about today is altitude training and how it can elicit performance benefits for athletes. We're going to talk about what it is, how to do it, the benefits, the implications, and everything in between. But Geordie, you were the one that kind of threw this idea out here, and just give all of our listeners a bit of a background as to why we're going to be talking about altitude training today.
Yeah, good intro for one, Loz, straight off the bat. But super interesting topic because Dojo and I were just in Salt Lake City in Utah for UFC 278 with Leon Edwards. And Salt Lake City sits at 4,500 feet, if I'm not mistaken. But it's part of Utah, right? Utah and Colorado are the highest points across America. And where we were staying was in this Airbnb at the base of like 5 or 6 trailheads. So I got some really, really good training in there and got to go up some mountains that were going up to about 8,500 feet or so. And, that's above where they have the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, like down the road, or down the Rockies, I should say. And it was really interesting, super interesting to see how my body responded during those training sessions, like how it changed from even the first day of the week to the end of it, what it was like when I got back here to Brisbane and started running at sea level. But it was also very interesting seeing Leon. Obviously, he knew he was fighting and competing in Salt Lake City. So it's not like a crazy high altitude. And we'll talk about that, like how you classify the degrees of altitude. So it's probably like I'd say more of an intermediate type altitude. But still, when you're coming from a town that Leon lives in, what is like Birmingham, I think it's like 180 meters or something. So 400 feet or whatever. That's their altitude. Yeah, exactly. So it's like he had to do some type of preparation. His preparation was sleeping in a altitude tent. And we'll talk about whether or not I thought that was effective. I wasn't involved in the decision making on that. But I think anyone who watched that fight would have seen that, Leon experienced that altitude. And me and him spoke about it at length afterwards. And it was one of those things where I kind of said to him, I was like, man, like I kind of knew you would struggle with it because I'm pretty fit and I can do some pretty crazy stuff when it comes to this like cardiovascular work and all this running. And when I went up into the mountains, it was really hard. And I didn't want to say anything to him because I knew it would get in his head and he's going into the biggest fight of his life. But we spoke about it afterwards and he basically said like, yeah, that altitude is no joke. And at that level, and we'll talk about the theoretical percentages of that you lose on VO2 max and everything else at that level, when you're fighting the number one guy, the number two guys, it's literally a game of inches. And if you're losing 5 to 10% of your VO2 max because you didn't do your altitude training, you're not acclimated to it as best as you should be, that can lose you the fight. So there's a lot of cool things to go over here, but Loz, I'll throw it back to you to get us started.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, with these top level athletes, it is the 1%ers, it is the 2%ers. And when we talk about athletic performance, we're quick to talk about the physical training and also nutrition and how important training and nutrition go hand in hand. But that's not going to help you if you're, come from a cold climate and you're training you're going to be competing in a really hot climate, or same with Leon, you live really close to sea level and then you're going to be competing at quite a high altitude. So it's no wonder athletes are kind of looking to do all of these different types of training to get a one-up when it comes to competition because, altitude, I mean, I've never competed high altitude, but you go on holidays, you go hiking or whatever up in the mountains and you think, hey, I don't recall being this unfit. So, it does have a huge impact. But, Yeah, so pretty much altitude training, I suppose we should start with, okay, what is altitude? So when we're talking about altitude, we're referring to the vertical elevation of an object above a surface. And typically when we're talking about altitude, we are measuring it from sea level. So an increase in altitude is associated with a decrease in atmospheric pressure and a corresponding reduction in oxygen availability. So it's not necessarily that, you know, when you get higher, there's less oxygen. It's just that there's less pressure. So with each breath that we take, we're taking in less oxygen than we would at sea level. So this is where, you know, kind of all those issues come around with feeling breathlessness and as though we're not getting enough oxygen. Oxygen's still there. It's just in a different chemical makeup to what it would be down on the land. And you mentioned, Geordie, you know, there's all the different classifications of altitude, and kind of depending where you're reading, the rough kind of classifications are low altitude is around 500 to 2,000 meters, moderate 2,000 to 3,000 meters, high 3,000 to 5,500 meters, and extreme altitude is anything above 5,500 meters. And if you're in America and you work in feet, I'm so sorry I didn't put feet in here, but for me, my brain calculates in meters. But, you know, when it comes to altitudes, I always think of Mount Everest, which is in the extreme altitude category at, you know, 8,800 meters. But luckily, nobody's running ultra marathons up there. So we don't need to really worry about that extreme level. But yeah, do you have anything else to add before we dive in, Geordie?
Yeah, just that point. I think it's important to reiterate when we talk about altitude. It's not that there is less oxygen, like Loz said. It's just the pressure of the oxygen that is up there is less. So it's less dense, as we say. And I think it's important you realize that is that there's still just as much oxygen, nitrogen, and whatever else gases are up in the air. It's just as you go higher, there's less pressure. It's like when you dive in the sea, and as you go down further and further, there's just more water particles and more water on top of you. So the pressure increases. It's the opposite when you go up into the air. There's just less pressure as you go higher and higher. And if you think about the mechanics of how our lungs work, they pretty much just work on what we call negative pressure. So you need pressure to be able to breathe in and exhale. So when we go up into these higher altitudes, it physically gets a lot harder because there's less of that pressure to be able to work this negative pressure system that causes us to breathe in oxygen and exhale CO2. But we'll get into all of that.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess now that you understand what altitude is, altitude training is literally that. It's training at a different altitude. And typically when we're talking about altitude training, you're training at an altitude that's higher than and where you live at. So for example, you know, we live on the coast in Australia. We're very much sea level. Someone who lives in, Colorado, Lake Louise in Canada, you're going to be at those higher altitudes. So altitude training, it kind of helps our body, which we're going to talk about now, adapt to that thinner type of air quality. And yeah, so our body can, you know, our body's pretty clever. We can train it. So yeah, altitude training, similar to nutritional training or physical training, ultimately, it just helps us elicit all these adaptations that can help performance.
Yeah. And I think it's important that people understand that there's short and long-term effects of altitude training. So say if we are here, I don't know, say we're in Vancouver and then we drive up to the Rocky Mountains and you end up in Banff or wherever and you are very high. Or if you're, I don't know, like I was when I was in Salt Lake City and then I ran up the top of these mountains and I went from 4,000 to 8,500 feet, like it's a fair bit of climb. You experience short-term like altitude and your body will adjust to that. And then when we talk about training, we're talking about more chronic long-term adaptations of what happens in that short term. And some of the things that you see when you're in that short term, you go up there, first thing you notice is your heart just starts beating. Like it just goes so much faster. One, because you're walking up these crazy hills, but because the air is getting so much thinner. And like we said, there's less pressure to get that oxygen around. Our body can't put all that oxygen around our body and get it to our working muscle. So we have to pump more blood to get our muscles enough nutrients to keep going. And then with that, our breathing increases. So you notice straight away your breathing rate will increase. And this is something I knew was going to happen. And I've worked with a breathing coach for years and years, and I knew it and we've spoken about it. And even when you're trying to do your breathing, you're trying to do like your gear work and go through nose breathing, mouth breathing, it's tough. Like you notice it and you feel it straight away. And it's not so much, I won't describe it as bad as breathing through a straw because that's pretty intense, but it's that concept is true. Like you absolutely do not feel it. One other thing that I noticed when I went out there for longer is you do urinate a lot more. And that's to do with, even in that short term, your blood will become more alkaline. And the way that your kidneys is just a response mechanism is that it'll cause you to urinate more to rebalance the pH in your blood. But they're pretty much the three big ones that you'll notice immediately. Say if you're actually up on the hill in the short term is increased heart rate, increased breathing, you'll probably urinate. The fourth one that a lot of people don't really think about, and it's especially true when you're, say, just where we were in Salt Lake City, it's not crazy high altitude, but your sleep can get affected. And that's really, really important, because if you think about it, if you are training, even not even going up the mountains or just running around the streets or whatever it is, your sleep is all your recovery, right? So if your sleep's disturbed, then you're going to not have as good recovery. So when you go up the next day, it's probably not going to be as good. And I definitely experienced that in Salt Lake City. There were just some nights where I just could not get to sleep. I was tossing, turning, getting all these like weird coughs because my breathing was out and I couldn't really figure it out. And kind of a light kind of switch. And I was like, it's because of the altitude. I need to like figure this out. And it took me a few days, but I did get used to it. But man, it was uncomfortable.
It's hard, hey. And yeah, there's that one, obviously, the impact it can have on our sleep, but there's a couple of other minor implications that come with altitude training. So we can touch on those later. But yeah, that was a really good summary, Geordie. And as you mentioned, initially when you are exposed to those high altitude, low oxygen environments, our body compensates. Our body's very clever. It always needs to try and fix immediately to try and solve the problem. And initially what's going to happen is, we will have that increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, which is why you can often feel very out of breath when you're hiking these mountains. It's a bit of a kick to the confidence. You think you're so fit, and then here you are breathing like a crazy person. And until you adapt, which can be quite a fast process, you can experience symptoms like Geordie mentioned, breathlessness, fatigue, sleeplessness, even nausea as well, headaches, confusion, all these things. And we'll talk about altitude sickness as well. But as I said, our body's very clever. And it doesn't take too long for our body to begin adapting. And with increased exposure to these lower oxygen environments, our body begins to produce some more erythropoietin, or EPO. And it's actually a hormone that's produced by our body. So what this hormone does is it signals to make more red blood cells. And in case you don't know, red blood cells carry oxygen all through our body. So it's super important to have a lot of them, at sea level. But when we reach those higher elevations where we're not getting as much oxygen in, we need all the help that we can get. So as our body starts to adapt to these high altitude environments, we are producing more red blood cells to try and carry that oxygen throughout the body. And also during this process, our blood plasma actually starts to decrease. And with a decrease in volume, our hemoglobin concentration is higher. Now, hemoglobin is the molecule that helps to transport oxygen all through our body. So it's really important as well that we do have high levels of hemoglobin. So together, the increased volume of red blood cells and hemoglobin is going to help our body to become more efficient at transporting oxygen through the body to the muscles. And especially when we're talking about sports performance, you really want this to be happening, because the more oxygen that's being delivered to the muscles, the faster we can move. It helps our exercise capacity, our aerobic capacity, as you mentioned, Geordie, will improve. We'll get better at managing our heart rate, managing our breath work as well. So, obviously there's the benefit there in terms of our blood cells, but also as we adapt to these high altitude environments, our aerobic capacity is increased as well in terms of breathing rate, heart rate. And, talking about EPO, I think it's probably good to mention that this is often, comes up a few times in doping issues. I know there's been a few things with the Tour de France athletes in the past, but EPO, as I mentioned, is actually produced by our body. But some people, they like to go a little bit over the top and actually intentionally dope with EPO because of the impact it can have with increasing red blood cell volume. So obviously we're not suggesting to do that, but it's just important to note that if you've ever heard of EPO or EPO doping, it's actually because this hormone that our body naturally produces is pretty awesome. It's helping us to increase our red blood cell volume. But we can do it naturally by training at high altitudes. So you don't need to dope.
Yeah, that's pretty much the whole crux of why you're doing the high altitude training, right? Is to increase the EPO in your system to produce more red blood cells to get greater oxygen delivery. I'm sure most people who are listening to this, if you're an endurance athlete, I'm sure you've read Tyler Hamilton's book where he kind of spilled the beans about, Lance Armstrong and the Tour de France and how pretty much everyone on the tour was doping. And this was one of the tactics, right? Like not only were they using artificial EPO and putting that hormone in, they were also doing blood transfusions to increase the red blood cells to help increase that oxygen delivery. And it worked, right? Like even in the book, Tyler Hamilton talks about it. And they talk about how great they felt, once they get that EPO in and they get those extra red blood cells, because you're quite literally being able to transfer more oxygen to the working muscle and being able to go further for longer and go a lot harder while you're doing it.
It's pretty crazy to think that people obviously go to that level, but just because, there's some pretty significant performance benefits. And, altitude training has definitely become quite a popular training protocol among the elite athletes. And this is not only to increase exercise capacity at the sea level, but in Leon's case, where he lives at sea level and he's going to compete at a high altitude. So incorporating altitude training, which we're going to talk about some protocols, helps you to be able to function better, to be able to perform better, whether you're going up in altitude or you're competing at sea level. So there's obviously great benefits for either one of those options. But ultimately, as we've just discussed, the increased red blood cell, increased oxygen delivery to the muscles is what increases athletic performance. So that's pretty much it in terms of benefits.
Yeah, this next point's really good that we're going to talk about. And I'm sure now that like breath work is such an important part and really more mainstream in a lot of sports, performance as well, we all hear this word hypoxia or hypoxic breathing, or you hear Wim Hof and he talks about going hypoxic. And even when you talk about altitude training, right? Like you hear people refer to this as hypoxic training.
Yeah. So if you're thinking, what on earth is that word? I've actually never heard it, Geordie. I actually live under a rock and I've never heard it. What hypoxia refers to is when there's little to no oxygen present in our body's tissues. And hypoxia can actually be really bad. You don't want to lose oxygen in your tissues, or if you're up, climbing Mount Everest and you're starting to freeze, or your oxygen tank, you have an issue with your oxygen tank, you do not want to be going hypoxic in that, in that sense. However, hypoxic training is essentially intentionally training with reduced oxygen availability, which is what altitude training is. So as I mentioned, usually being in a hypoxic environment can be quite dangerous, but in order to elicit these training adaptations, hypoxic training can actually be really beneficial, and hypoxic training, altitude training pretty much go hand in hand. However, there are some artificial methods of training that you can do to mimic this hypoxic state.
Yeah. And I think anyone that's done or seen like Wim Hof breathing, and if you've done the breath work yourself, the reason you can hold your breath for 2+ minutes is because you go hypoxic, right? Like you're actually depleting all of the oxygen and you're building up the CO2. And it's a big thing. We won't get into it. We might do another podcast about it called CO2 tolerance training. That's essentially what's happening in your body. Like when you go up to high altitudes, or if you do this hypoxic breathing and you hold your breath, you're training your body to be able to tolerate these high levels of CO2. The thing is when you have more CO2 and oxygen going down, like you're starving your brain and you're starving your organs of oxygen. This is like when you start seeing like closing in and start going black, and you see people pass out. Like it's a very natural reaction in the body when CO2 builds up to pass out, hit the floor, and then take a big gasp of breath in to be able to replace that oxygen.
Definitely. And that's not what we want to achieve. And I think it's probably a good segue into something important that we should address, which is altitude sickness. But ultimately, I don't know, whenever I hear altitude sickness, I never think of athletes. I always think of people hiking. I know that's so silly, but you forget that, okay, yes, altitude sickness is a real thing. And as we mentioned before, initially you feel sick, you feel really out of breath, it can impact your sleep. But ultimately, all of these things are occurring because we don't have enough oxygen circulating through our body. So altitude sickness, symptoms could include shortness of breath, you've got nausea, decreased appetite and dehydration, which are obviously big red flags for athletes, especially if you're training or competing, feeling lightheaded, as we mentioned, Geordie, insomnia, having trouble sleeping, mental confusion, fatigue, weakness, cyanosis. That's when your skin can start to lose color, goes a bit blue and purple. So the reality of being at high altitudes is you may not experience some of these symptoms, but if it's not controlled, which is why, again, coming back to hiking here, but when you're doing Everest Base Camp, you'll acclimatize. So you go up certain points and then you hang out there for a little bit so your body can get used to it. And you go up further the next day so your body can get used to it. Whereas if you're going from sea level all the way up to Mount Everest, you're probably going to experience all those things that I just listed and maybe not make it back down the mountain. But again, this is where implementing appropriate acclimatization into your altitude training protocol is going to come in handy. But yeah, in terms of altitude sickness, if it isn't managed properly, or if you go too high too quickly, you can run the risk of, you know, it being life-threatening. And I don't know if anyone's watched 14 Peaks, that documentary on Netflix. I think it's such a good one. But the guy in the film NIMS, he talks about HACE, which is high altitude cerebral edema, and that's ultimately fluid buildup in the brain, which is pretty serious, pretty dire, and it can impact your cognition and your behavior. And from memory, in the documentary, he imagined an abominable snowman or something. So, you know, altitude sickness is very serious, and it can lead to pretty bad consequences. But, you know, when done correctly, you might feel a bit sick, you might have trouble sleeping. But yeah, Geordie, your experience.
Yeah, like you definitely experience a lot of those things. I know when I went up, and I think it was the second day when I actually went to the peak of this second mountain. I did one mountain, the first one, and I only went up about, I'd say halfway, 3/4, and I had to sit down. I was like, man, this is tough. Like I was panting, breathing. I could only do like 30-meter, 40-meter bit like sprints up the hill. But like, keep in mind, this elevation was pretty bonkers. But I had to sit down, stop, and then I had to go back down because, yeah, I was getting the headache. I was getting like quite lightheaded. I was starting to feel dizzy. And it's like, you probably could push through, but it's silly, right? Because if you're feeling that there, like imagine what you're going to be feeling at the top when it may only be an extra, 1,000 feet or whatever it is. And, as you go up, the more you go up, the less pressure there is in that air, the less oxygen you're going to be getting. And you're just not acclimatized. Like the first day I went up was really rough. And even like, after a few days when I started getting used to it and I went the next mountain higher, like I absolutely felt it. And there were points where I was getting like kind of closing in. I wasn't to the point, like it wasn't high enough where I'd be getting severe altitude sickness, but definitely like the early stages. I think one of the other things that we haven't mentioned here and that I experienced really badly was the dehydration. Like the dehydration was something that really shook me. And it makes a lot of sense. Like we were talking about, your heart is constantly pumping. And then your breath, like you're constantly breathing no matter. And like I said, I do a lot of breath work. It's kind of like I kind of center my whole training regime and my whole training like philosophy on your breath. And if you control your breath, you can control your rhythm, you can control your technique, and you can go for days. It's hard to control your breath when you're up there and you've got that lack of oxygen and you're not used to it. And you start rapidly breathing. As you rapidly breathe, you obviously lose more fluid through water vapor in there. And just to give you guys numbers, like I normally walk around, if I'm feeling really good, I walk around like 70 to 72 kilos and I feel really good. If I drop below about 70 kilos, like I don't feel as great and I tend to get a bit more injured. And when I was up in these mountains, I usually lose in a training session. If I go for say 3 hours, I'm a pretty heavy sweater. I'll lose like 1.5 liters per hour. I could lose anywhere between 3 and 4 liters, and that's pretty normal. These sessions, I was coming down and I was jumping on the scale. One day I hit just above 66.8. And then I got down to 67 one day and then 68 on another day. Normally, I never ever like seeing below 70 when I've been on top of my hydration. I fueled up beforehand. I'm getting fluid in while I'm training. If I go below 70, I know I've stuffed something up. And because the dehydration on these mountains was so severe, I was dropping liters and liters of fluid, both through sweat and the increased water vapor. And I was feeling it. And it was something that was
increased urination. You said you were peeing a lot more than normal. So then again, fluid's just coming out of you.
Yeah. And these are like weights that I haven't seen for years. Like I would never, ever intentionally let myself get that light just every day walking around. And in training, if I've let my body deplete down to that much, I've stuffed up my hydration and my fueling strategy massively. So the fact that like I got through and I wasn't even that aware of it because you're trying to deal with like, yeah, the slight nausea and then the lightheadedness and then the dehydration is probably compounding those effects as well. And again, keep in mind, this isn't that high. This is at an intermediate altitude. So like these are pretty severe things. So I can only imagine when people are going up to these high altitudes and trying to get this training in, just how severe these acute symptoms can be and how detrimental they can be to your training and your performance and your health if you don't address them properly.
Was this something that Leon was aware of, or that you were mindful of with him? Obviously, while you're over there, you're there during that whole week. When you're cutting weight, obviously there's, water loading or water manipulation going on there, but, how did you manage this with him?
Yeah, so we were pretty diligent in tracking and what his weight were and what we call like your overnight float, knowing that in this altitude, he should theoretically be floating because he should be breathing more and losing more. And it did end up being the case. So we were very mindful to adjust, say, his water load and how much fluid he was getting in to compensate for the extra losses. I guess in a weird way, it did kind of help when it came to cutting the weight, because even just going out for a walk, you're going to lose more fluid through the water vapor and urination and everything else than you normally would. But it's definitely like a consideration. But I think like a big point that I think we need to make here and people need to be aware of is like altitude training can be super beneficial. Like it can be very, very beneficial. Like if you can get through this and you can slowly go up and you say, I don't know what your thoughts are on it, Loz. Say you go 10 to 14 days and you slowly acclimate and then you start seeing these benefits. You need to remember that by the time in those 10 to 14 days taking you to acclimate, you're probably going to have quite a decrease in your training quality. And I think a lot of people don't talk about that. And they just say, hey, I'll go up to altitude and I'll go training. It'll be great. And I'll get these mad adaptations. I'll come back down to sea level. It'll be really cool. It's like, yeah, but also you need to keep in mind that for the 10 to 14 days that you're acclimating up there, you're probably having quite diminished sessions because of everything we just spoke about. And it's really important. And it's something that you need to work really closely with like your coach and your practitioner, whoever's advising is like, how do you time this? Like, how's the best way to time this and how to do this so you can peak properly? If you've got a competition, how do you come back down and make sure that you do have those adaptations and you didn't just go up there and then just get 3-4 weeks of really diminished training and then all of those benefits are gone by the time you're actually competing. So making sure you time this is really, really important.
Yeah, for sure. And, we're dietitians, we're not trainers or, Olympic performance coaches or anything like that. But what you just said is very important. It's so true, because to be honest, you don't need to be up there training at maximal intensity. Simply being at high altitude, you're going to start reaping the benefits. Whether you're going for an all-out run or you're just laying in bed, your body is working to adapt and to become more efficient at oxygen utilization. So from my perspective, not being a trainer or anything like that, I think obviously, yes, there would be multiple ways that you can incorporate altitude training into your training, but during a taper or during a period of training where you have a lighter load or you've got kind of less intense workouts would be good, because you're going to be up there, it's going to be hard, you're not going to be sleeping properly, recovery is going to be a little bit so. But ultimately, as long as you're up there in these high altitude environments, you're going to be seeing those physiological benefits. And we can kind of talk about the different methods that there are, Geordie, but the reason why some of these hypoxic style training tools or methods aren't that effective is because to get the biggest bang for your buck when it comes to altitude training, you need to be at high altitudes for 16 hours a day at least. If you're just going up there for a session or you're just sleeping there, probably not going to be getting those benefits. So ultimately, just living there, you're gonna really see the benefits of what comes with high altitude adaptations.
Yeah, and that's a good point, right? Like, and that's why they have the Olympic Training Center in Colorado. Why they have it so high is because to get these adaptations, like Loz just said, you need to be there for at least 16 hours of the day. So you always hear stories of people say they live lower at sea level and then they'll go up and then they'll go train at higher altitudes and they might get a 4 or 5 hour session. That could have a lot of benefits for, acute changes in your body and even mentally knowing that you can go up and do it. But in terms of getting the actual physiological response to altitude training, you're not going to get that with just that one session going from sea level up and just doing that a couple of times. You physically need to be up there and you don't even need to be training. Like you can just be hanging out in there. You can go on a nice little walk. You can just sit down and be up there and experience that lack of pressure and the less oxygen availability, and you're going to get that benefit. And I think this is where a lot of these kind of myths and misconceptions about how to train for altitude comes into play. And I'll talk about Leon and his prep. And again, this isn't something I was personally involved in, but he slept in an altitude tent every night for a couple of months leading up to that. And even that right is like it's a great idea and concept, but you're only really sleeping 6 to 8 hours. It's not enough time of exposure to the altitude to get that adaptation. Plus, when you wake up and you're going about your day, you're getting up, you're getting out of that environment and just going back to sea level for the rest of 16 to 18 hours of your day or however long. So it's kind of like take one step forward, take two steps back, and it's probably not going to do much. And it's the same when we talk about those weird little masks that are meant to imitate high altitude or whatever. You can't change the pressure of the oxygen around you by putting on a mask. You can absolutely restrict the amount of oxygen that you get for sure, but you're not going to be changing the actual pressure. So the best way to get this altitude training in is to go up and be in the altitude. And that doesn't necessarily mean you need to be training gun for like hell for leather every single day that you're up there. You just need to be in that altitude. And what we know is probably going to be the best is like 14 to 16 hours of your day being up there.
Yeah, definitely. And as you mentioned, yeah, those silly little masks on your face, altitude tents, hypoxia sleep chambers, even those, gyms that have those altitude training rooms. That's so cool. Go and do your 45-minute HIIT workout in your altitude training room. It's great to be able to train with reduced oxygen availability. But yeah, as you mentioned, the pressure is still the same. You're going to go out, go and get your coffee, go to work, continue about your day at sea level, and you're not going to be getting those benefits that come from being in that high altitude environment for long periods of time. And pretty much, research shows that you need to be up there for at least a week, if not 2 to 4 weeks, to really maximize those benefits.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important that that's a good consideration. I'll bring it back to like the fight that we just had on the weekend. Kamaru Usman, who Leon fought, looked like an absolute beast, but he does 8 weeks of his training camp up in Colorado Springs, where really close to the Olympic Training Center. So he's up at 6,000 feet. So he's actually coming down to Salt Lake City. So his body would have been very, very used to that lower oxygen availability. And when he came down to Salt Lake City, as weird as it sounds, probably had more oxygen availability than what he was used to. So his body was absolutely primed. And I guess that's the whole idea with the Olympic training centers or any of these altitude training centers, right? You take athletes that are going to be competing at lower altitude, you put them up there, you get those positive adaptations, and then there's a theoretical benefit. Or as Loz said earlier, you've got athletes who are, say, doing ultra endurance races, say like Leadville 100, which is just the craziest race where they're, starting the race at 9,000 feet or something. So you've got to get used to, and there's peaks up to 12,000 or whatever crazy amount it is. You need to do some type of altitude training to get used to that. So whether you're doing this to come down and compete at sea level or you've got competitions up, it is really useful, but you just have to know a few ins and outs of it. And it makes it so much more efficient. I think something that a lot of people don't talk about, right? Like if we were in Oz, like you and I are, Loz, like, I know I'm looking out my office window now. There's not a lot of like big mountains you can do this. Sometimes it's just absolutely not practical, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And that kind of brings us into the limitations of altitude training. And it's great for all those top level athletes that have sponsors that, they're paid to exercise 24/7. But for most of us, or for casual, more casual athletes, access, whether that's physical, as you mentioned, there's no mountains outside of either of our windows, but also the financial costs that comes with relocating to these high altitude environments to train. If you've got the funds behind you, if you've got the time to take off work, obviously, yes, that's so amazing. Get that prep in, go and train at a high altitude, but it's not accessible physically or financially for most people. And another, a few other limitations while we're talking about it is we all have different physiological responses to everything. It's the same as us saying, nutrition for you isn't the same as it is for me. The way your body responds to a high altitude might be different to another person's. For example, if you already have a really high, red blood cell count, you got high levels of hemoglobin, you're an elite level athlete, you're probably not going to see as big a change in your performance training at that altitude as opposed to, say, myself, who's not an elite level athlete going up there. Because of where our physiology lies, that difference is going to be more substantial for myself than it would be for an elite athlete. Of course, they're still going to benefit from it, and they do, but the changes in body's responses are always going to be different. You've also got the reality that this increase in red blood cell or increase in oxygen availability isn't going to last forever. I think, from what I understand, Geordie, correct me if I'm wrong, it's effective for around 2 weeks, that kind of increased oxygen delivery and aerobic capacity. But after a while, it does start to dwindle off. Again, comes back into tying your altitude training period in with competitions to make sure that you're getting the peak of maximum efficiency, really. And as well, Geordie, you mentioned sleep is impaired. When we're talking about athletes, obviously, yes, nutrition is a huge thing for recovery, but so is sleep. And when you're at high altitudes, it's very common to have poor quality and quantity of sleep, which can then impact recovery. So you're probably not going to be in your prime if you're spending extended periods of time at high altitude and you're training. So your recovery might take a little bit of a hit. As well, something that I think is quite interesting is your iron status. So iron, in case you don't know, if you want to know a little bit more, I know I've done a post on iron. Even the Dojo Dietitian's got a really great Instagram post on how iron works, but same with hemoglobin. So hemoglobin binds to iron and it helps to transport oxygen through our body. So in order for our body to be really efficient at delivering oxygen to our tissues, we need iron. And athletes, especially female athletes, we're already quite susceptible to being low in iron. So if you've already got low iron levels, it's going to be a little bit of an issue in terms of oxygen delivery. If you're then going to a high altitude environment and you have low iron, you got low hemoglobin, you're really going to struggle to have those adaptations and to have enough energy and oxygen availability. So ensuring that either medically or through your nutrition, that you are on top of your iron levels before going to a high altitude location is a really important consideration, which I think a lot of people probably would not even think about.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. I think if we're going to wrap this up now, I think if I was going to take everything that I know about altitude training plus the experience I just had in Utah, and there are definitely races I want to do over in the States that are at altitude, and I definitely want to go do some training camps out there and get up high. The things that I would be doing to make sure that I'm getting the most out of it is, one, I'll go into a town where I'm going to be living there and I'm not going to be training hell for leather every single day. I think you just have to appreciate that, you know, while we're up here, we're getting the physiological benefits, but we need to appreciate that we're not going to be hitting PBs, at least while we're acclimating to that. Save that for when you get back down to sea level. In terms of our nutrition, what I'm thinking of is your hydration is going to be hugely important, making sure you're staying on top. Because especially if you go at a nice time of the year, like I was in a really nice time of the year, you're not particularly feeling like you're too dehydrated or that you're sweating because you're up there. It's nice. There's a good breeze. The sweat's just coming straight off. You don't realize how much you're losing, but staying on top of that hydration is really important. Making sure you're eating enough and having enough calories when you're not training, plus when you are training, is really important. Like Loz said, all these things are going on in your body. You're getting like these slight bits of nausea and a bit of a headache, but decreased appetite is a real thing. And you don't necessarily feel like eating once you get down there. That was something I experienced like the first few days. It was hard for me to put all that weight on that I lost, given that it was just energy reserves and fluid. It was hard to put it back in because I just did not have the appetite. And it's just like, you kind of do feel really run down. You do just want to sleep, but then your sleep is kind of tarnished anyway while you're there. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle. Exactly. The next thing I would do is come up with some strategies for sleep. Like just do everything you can to make sure you've got good sleep hygiene, have a good routine, stay away from the lights, make sure that you're getting in and out at the same times, staying off your phone once you get there, making sure you're hydrated when you're going to sleep, like making sure you're in a nice room, you've got good blankets, you've got good pillows, all of that, just to do whatever you can to preserve your sleep. And obviously, like Loz just spoke about, if you are someone that's susceptible to low iron, that's something you really need to be mindful of once you're up there. But I think overall, that's a pretty good summary of altitude. It's crazy. Like it's a very, very interesting topic, right? And one of the coolest things I think when we talk about altitude and you go, oh, does it really make that much of a difference? And I think after what I just saw on the weekend with Leon, literally we're talking, like a lot of people talk about elite level athletes, and I'm not saying that people don't work with them, but like what we just did is that Leon is right now the elite level athlete. Like he just knocked out the pound for pound best fighter in the world. He just knocked him out. So when you beat the man, you become the man type thing. So it's like, that is elite level. And it's like these two guys going for it. And that altitude nearly did not help him at all. You know, like the altitude really nearly bit him in the bum. So it is absolutely a thing. I think if we think about I think it's 1968, the Summer Olympic Games in Mexico City, if you go back and you look at all the endurance records from that, all of the records just were slower. Like there were no records broken. They were all slower than the year previous and after. And the only records that were broken were aerodynamic records, like say javelin, when they're throwing a javelin and it's going to move further because there's less air resistance, because there's less pressure in the air. So there's less things condensing down and pushing that javelin back down to the earth, and less things slowing it down. So it does work. Like it's a thing that happens. Altitude, it's just being smart. And I couldn't encourage, if you want to explore it more, talk to your coach about it, plan it, don't just wing it. Like don't just go up the mountain and wing it. Like have a good plan if you're going to do it.
Yeah, good summary. Absolutely. Same with race day nutrition. Don't wing it. I definitely think there are some significant benefits. And if I, happen to become an elite level athlete anytime soon, I'll most definitely be going to Colorado or somewhere nice and training, because I think the benefits sound pretty cool. And I think you can do it smartly. But good chat, Geordie. Thanks for your insight, and also kind of bringing to light a bit about Leon's fight on the weekend as well, and incorporating that. But yeah, anyone that's listening, you got any questions, as always, flick Geordie or myself a message on Instagram or an email if you want to know some more info. Otherwise, stay tuned for the next podcast.